Hi, I'm Holly, I'm a writer, and I thought I would do a very brief video where I go through the writing process for a novel. And this is just my writing process. Everyone's is different. I think it can be really helpful to see other people's when you're a little unsure about what to do, where do I start, all that sort of stuff. But I'm gonna try and go through it kind of quickly, which might not happen. Okay, so first of all, I don't know how many steps this is actually. Probably like 5, maybe 6. But the first step, and you may have guessed this, you have to come up with an idea. And I don't know really how to help you with that. I personally have like a whole document just of my ideas. I have multiple ideas that I'm in multiple stages of development with, mostly just like in stage 2 of this plan, which you will obviously learn. But basically I feel that it depends on you, how you come up with ideas. Sometimes you get struck down by one, and sometimes you have to maybe think it through and think, is this an idea that I could use? Is this a book that I would want to read? Maybe I should write it. And I don't know how to help with that, so we're gonna just move on. I guess what I will say though is pick an idea that is something you're passionate about and that you feel very like, I could get this done in like a week if I put my mind to it. But don't pick something that is impulsive. Pick something that you know you will still have that same passion for in a few months, because most likely, depending on who you are, you're not going to have a million hours a week to work on your book. And it can take years for people to write a book, especially if they have like work and studies and whatnot. And mental energy is a thing as well. Pick something that you will be happy to read a million times, something that you will be able to pick up for the next year at least, and pick something that frankly, it's actually enjoyable to you, because otherwise you're going to be miserable. That's like the 3 things. So that's my advice. Stage 2, basically this is the research stage. Now, the reason why you want to research is because you need to figure out a few things. First of all, you want to research if there are other books like your book, right? You figured out the idea, you figured out presumably the genre, the sort of age that you wanted to be aimed at, and I would guess like you've probably got an idea of like maybe a character or a main sort of cast of characters. Anyway, you want to figure out the main sort of things about your story outside of the idea, like the age, the genre, and then you want to do research for it. What are the books that have been published in that genre recently, okay, or ever? Sometimes it's just helpful to see the classic works in that genre as well, for yourself. But you want to figure out, how is this sort of story usually written? You also want to figure out the details. If it's a contemporary story, this probably isn't going to need as much extensive research because you are a contemporary being. Congratulations. But if it's like a historical novel, you might need to research time periods and sort of the way that life was in those, different times. It could be that you are looking up conventions of the genre. For example, if you're writing a dystopian, I think it is very important to make sure that what you are writing is actually a dystopian and not a romance set in a gritty background. I don't want to name the name, but there was a book that did that, and that kind of called itself a dystopian and compared itself to other dystopians without actually having any of the things that make a dystopian a dystopian. The book I'm reading at the minute is Cahokia Jazz by Frances Spufford, and this is a dystopian noir novel set in 1920s America, and it is fascinating. And it's fascinating because right at the very beginning, the first thing that you read from this story is that there are different words for different types of people. So there's a word for a native person, which is basically Native Americans. you have black people, and then white people from Europe specifically. And those are the words. And the idea is that throughout this book, those words are used to describe people and to give you context about the racism that these people experience, the sort of social class that these people are a part of, the percentage of these people that are in the city based off of this city's racial dynamics. Hi. Basically, I think that it's really interestingly done. It is very clear and memorable when you read it, as long as you're paying attention. And I think it's interesting that there's like a whole language that's in here. And I don't know anything about how like real this is. I don't know if it's actually taking from a real language, but it's one of those things where it feels very well done. You want that level of research for yourself. You want to make sure that your world makes sense. You want to make sure that your history, your geography, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, basically, when you're in the research stage, you should be researching everything. No matter what book you're writing, it helps to do research. And this could also include things like story structure, writing styles. If you're not sure what your writing style is and you need help with that, there are lots of much more helpful things than I've got. Are you trying to get onto my pillow? You okay? But yeah, you want to just basically figure everything out. My first book was about Formula One. I did a bunch of research into Formula One. I took a bunch of notes about stuff, even if I thought that I would remember them, just in case. I did research into the calendars for the years that the story is set in. I did research into the regulations, the changes that would happen. I did research into the different Formula One teams to figure out where it would be likely that my fictional teams might be from. Into things like the way that the factories work, into sort of when contracts were given, which obviously differs, but you know, it honestly, for me, the process of research differs very much. My World War II series that I want to write, my duology, that is based off of real events that happen, and so I need to know those events inside and out so that I can write a fictional version of them. And if I started writing without knowing that, it would be very difficult for me to write. So you basically need to figure out what you actually need to know. If you don't end up knowing something and you're like, oh, I should have researched this, you can either stop and research it, or you can just leave a placeholder. But you want to get as much of the research done as possible so that you're not running that risk of having to stop every 5 minutes to do something, you know, in terms of the way of research, whether that's a little Google search or like buying a book because you can't understand it without reading a whole book about it, you know? You want to do that before you start writing. As tempting as it is to just jump right in, trust me, it is better to do the research and the planning. Which leads into the third thing, which is to create an outline. Once you have all of your information, okay, and your research, that includes into your characters, where your characters are from, the sort of lives that they've led, their traits and whatnot. Again, there are so many like resources online about this. Really get to know your characters. I personally find that I get to know them best when I'm already in, but things like birthdays, I think it's useful to know how old they are at the very least. It's useful to know when their birthday is so that if you're running a story that takes place across a year, you know when their birthday is. I think it's interesting to look things up, like if I look at my notes. This is my Formation Lab notes. And a lot of this is on previous drafts, but I just have like likes and dislikes. So her favourite colour, her favourite animal, the kind of TV shows and stuff that she likes. And I think that honestly, it's one of those things where it's like, imagine that your character was on TV. What would people headcanon for that character? Because that's the sort of stuff that if you reference it, it's like how Remus Lupin mentioned chocolate like once, and now everyone's like, he loves chocolate. He's never without chocolate. You want to just really cover off like all bases with stuff like that, because it really adds a layer of depth that even if it's just a throwaway line, it can do a lot. So that's sort of stuff that you would count in your research. And then in the outlining stage and like the actual plotting stage, you take all of that research and you turn it into a story. Now, I would highly recommend things like the Save the Cat beat sheet, the 3 and the 4 act structure, just different things where you learn about storytelling and when things typically happen, the ups, the downs. It's never like, you don't have to follow it exactly, but it's a very good guideline. And the Save the Cat book for me was more helpful than the online beat sheets, although it is free online. So you don't have to pay, and there are probably a lot of videos again explaining about that. I don't have any examples of it, which is annoying, but it's very useful, and I cannot recommend it enough. You should look into stuff like that. And for me, let me get up my outline for my current project, which is my vampire Romeo and Juliet. If I go onto my outline, there are 20 chapters and an epilogue, and some of these are super long. I can't show you it. The first chapter, the only thing that I've written is that my character, one of them, goes and tries to kill the other character. That is it. And that's all that I need, because the first chapter for me is setting up the vibes. It's setting up the idea of the story. It's making it clear this is a vampire. And basically having it be like, you know, the setup of the entire thing. You then later on get way more, like so much more. The longest one is this one, which is like 20 lines of just like stuff that I haven't gotten to yet even. And it's very detailed. It talks almost beat for beat through what's going to happen in this chapter. And that is really helpful, because sometimes all it takes is that one line, you know, she has to kill this character, and that's like all that has to happen in this one chapter, because this chapter is the first chapter. It is it's, you know, you go out, you set up the world, you introduce the characters, and then you start, depending on how long it is. For me, the first chapter is like 5,000 words, I think. So that's when the catalyst happens, which is her trying to kill him. And that is like super easy, because I know that I just want to set up the world. I want to give up, you know, a few details about her appearance, his appearance, the sort of music that they like, for example, because that's a pretty big thing, because it's set in the 70s. So it's like, hey, it's a vampire who's in the 70s. Like, you know, you're doing very minimal outlining stuff perhaps for that first chapter, because you know how a story works. You know what you include in a first chapter because you've read first chapters. Whereas later on, you need to remember to include these details, all of this list of details, because it's kind of important. You've got to tie up threads that have already been introduced. You've got to create new ones. It really, like, it gets complex, and that's why you need the outline, because yes, sometimes you're going to just be like, I don't need to plan anything, because what I know is that I'm going to just make a really fun chapter with good vibes, and that's it. But then sometimes you do need to have a tighter grip on the plot. And that, it helps you, okay, I promise. It's really boring sometimes, but it helps. With fantasy, it is more difficult, and like science fiction and whatnot, because there are differences to the world. You know, you've got to come up with things like the rules for the magic system, for these creatures, for blah 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 blah. What you want to do is really like think of every possible detail. There are resources online, things like currency, religion, history of the fictional place that you're in, or the place that is real. This is really important. If you set it in a real place, it's like an urban fantasy, you want to figure out how the magic system would affect the real world history. Because if it has no effect, why is there magic there besides vibes? You see? and it weakens the story. So you want to think about stuff like that before you start writing, because otherwise you might end up with a plot point that doesn't make any sense, or with a plot point that is just not worth it and you've spent like half the story talking about it. I didn't know that Natasha and Joel were gonna be the main characters of my story until like the second draft, and I was like, why did I not make him a main character to begin with again? And there was no reason except that I didn't know how to plan, because it was my first book and I didn't really know what I was doing. I just wanted to jump right in. So plan the whole story using structures that I've been given, figure out something that sort of makes sense, that sounds good, and then each chapter give as much detail as you think is necessary, maybe a little bit more, depending on how close you are to it. Because you might say today, well, I know how I want the final chapter to go, but when it comes to writing the final chapter, if that's like a year away, you might not remember. So do pay attention to stuff like that as well. I think that's you know, it's important to consider your own personal time scale as well, because then you can set like goals for when you want to complete the first chapter, when you want to finish the first half of the book, and that can be very good for motivation when we get to draft 1, 2, 3, 4, however many you get through, where you just are starting to feel like this world is stale, not because it is actually stale, but because you've been in it for so long. Now we're getting into the next step, okay? So you've got your idea, you've done your research, you've got your plan, you have to draft it now. And I'm sorry, because, you know, you think this is going to be super exciting, and in a way it is, but then also it kind of is awful, because you're just looking at your work like, what did I do, you know? And it's kind of awful to feel that way about your work, but don't worry. It honestly isn't that difficult, especially if you've planned, okay? If you go off plan, also that's fine. First draft can be a mess. You just gotta get the words down on page, and there's not a huge amount of stuff that I can do to explain this part to you. Follow your outline as much as possible, do what feels right, and you will figure it out on the way. If it feels awful, push through. Chances are when you read it back, you'll be like, yeah, it's not the best, but it's not as bad as I felt it was at the time. As I mentioned, I made a bunch of notes. Draft 2 is where it gets a bit more complicated. I know that a bunch of people have different thoughts on this. My personal method is to rewrite, and I say to rewrite. When I say rewrite, what I mean is that I'm editing what's already there by rewriting it word for word into a new document, but better, right? So you have different stage of edits. You have developmental edits. That is the first one we want to do. That means things like moving around the different chapters, putting in a new plot line, adding or removing characters. This is where you start to realize, maybe I need to kill off some of my darlings. I personally... Hello. So in my notes, I wrote very specifically, like, basically to make her life worse. Make my main character, Natasha's life, a little bit worse during her time in Formula One. And to... I think that's the main thing, is that in the first draft, especially if it's your first book, which you probably... it might be your first book if you're watching this, or if you're just curious, hi. But basically, you want to punish your characters more than you initially feel willing to do. Or maybe you really love doing that. That's great. But I personally felt like I don't want her to be in pain. So I had to make a bunch of notes, of which the first one counts to just be like more struggles for her of this kind, blah, 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 blah. More detail. One of my notes is to rewrite in third past tense, which I didn't do because I didn't end up actually thinking that that was worth doing. I thought it worked really well in this one. I changed a lot in this. One of my notes was to add like weather to make sure that I wasn't being a bit of a coward in my storytelling by making it easier for myself by not including other factors like weather. To do research into this thing that I hadn't considered, to remove crutch words in the next draft, to make my chapters a little bit more uniform in length than they were, which I did do, and to sort of like add little things in that end up becoming a bigger thing later, so that they sort of build up over time rather than just appearing. That's the sort of thing that I think is really useful. I didn't mention her birthday at one point, even though it had just happened, so I felt like it made sense to mention it, just so that people knew that I hadn't, you know, thrown that in there randomly. I think this is kind of important. I also really cut down my character list even further than is in this one here. I think I cut out like one more person from this. One of them says to mention one of those characters more who doesn't end up being there. Like, there's just like little notes. I also did bits about getting to know my character. Yeah. And I just think while you're editing, it can be really weird. But what I do is I get a completely new document, empty, and I hold the other one alongside it. And usually what you would do is you would wait in between your first and your second draft, and you would wait for like a month or something. I waited, I think, like 2 weeks, and then I edited while I read over it on a physical copy. So I would highlight things that I didn't like, make little notes, suggestions for myself, and then I got up my fresh document. I had the old version with the notes, and I went through and I rewrote it chapter by chapter with those notes. And a lot of those notes, as I said, they were developmental, but they were also things like just making the sentences sound a bit better as I went, because it would make sense. And then the third draft, I had beta reader feedback. I think that's very valuable. It's very recommended that you, in fact, even like agents, they say like you should have someone put their eyes on this work before you send it to us, at least one person. So get an edit, like a sort of little, you know, a free editor in the form of a beta reader who will give you feedback on things that don't work. And then you can use that information from an outside perspective. Mine were from outside perspectives, mine weren't like friends' perspectives. I got people who didn't have any connection to me besides just having the kindness to read over my work with no reward, right? The feedback I got from that was really helpful. I expanded on the characters that they liked. The moments that they liked and whatnot, I really worked on those. Their least favourite moments, the moments they thought were sort of dragging the story a little bit, I went through those, and it's really helpful. And then the third edit, it wasn't a complete rewrite. It was going through and reading sort of chapter by chapter, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, to make sure that these things were fixed, and also to, again, just make these like lines smoother, to make them flow better, to make sure that the characterizations were right, to make sure that the speech was all done right. And I think that for me, it took like 4 drafts and a bunch of editing to get where it is now, but I am so happy with it. And the next stage, I think, honestly, is just to let it rest. I let mine rest for a few months, like 6 months, and the difference in my editing mindset in those 6 months was huge. And so I rewrote it. Again, I say rewrote. I went through in a blank document, read a paragraph at a time. Basically what I do, I look at paragraph, I have my notes like the chapter, the things that I want to keep. If I want to keep the chapter at all, I cut like 3 chapters, I think, from that draft, and I read the chapter, read over the paragraph, and I think about that paragraph, the next paragraph, and the paragraph before. How does this paragraph fit with the paragraph before? Does it feel kind of jarring? to go from that to this? And how can I make it better with the next paragraph also in mind? And it's hard to explain that, but okay, so if I read my first draft, the very first draft has a prologue, which is crazy. The second draft doesn't. I do think that there is there's something to be said about the character that's shown in this. It's not like it's out of the same sort of style or anything as the rest, but it just really isn't as good. Why is it all bunched up like this? This is so annoying. Anyway, the very first draft is insanely different. So if I read out the first, actually, you know what? If you read what's on the page, I will read it out loud, but you can read it. It begins with, "The smell of hot air mingling with petrol and burnt rubber is one of the best smells in the world." Now, I really liked that line. And if you look at the new one, you'll see that that is still kind of included, but instead it begins, "Under the swollen Bahrain sun, heat lines rise from the tarmac of the car park." This is a setting. Okay, you instantly get the vibe that you are in a desert that is very warm. And that the sun, perhaps swollen, usually it gives a very specific image when it's related to the sun, right? You then have, "In this part of the desert where sand sweeps underfoot at every breath of wind," which again, the desert, there is literal sand. "The scent of hot air mingling with petrol and burnt rubber pervades me, works its way into my cells until I'm intoxicated." It doesn't say out loud, "This is the best smell in the world," but intoxicated into her cells, you know, it's very specific. It's you know, the imagery is a bit more there. It's got a bit more voice, is the way that a lot of people described it. And you then go into another sentence that moves on from the scent, but in the same way. So it says, "It lingers around the track, accompanied by frenzied engines and the whir of wheel guns." That is an auditory sense, right? It's like, you want for people to be immersed, basically. And so you've got the sight, you understand that it's probably hot because the sun is the first thing that's mentioned. There are heat lines, there is sand, there is the smell of hot air and petrol and rubber. You've got the sounds of engines and the wheel guns. Hi, Babs. And then you have the line, "I'm pulled back into my childhood, the school breaks spent in overalls and a helmet," which sells you very easily. Like, it's not a huge line, you know, but it's like, this is somebody who has been in this sort of place before. It is something that she has been doing for a long time because she's an adult now, and it reminds her of her childhood. And then the next line, "It is understandable why part of me feels at home, but there's more to it now." There's that like one line that you're like, interesting, right? Like, why is it different now? And then it mentions the cameras, and so you think, that's interesting. You get this sense, and it feels weird to talk about this my own work, but from like a more analytical sense, like an objective standpoint, the way that it transforms from her childhood to her present day, you get this vibe of who this person is. You have a sense of where you are, of the place that you're in as you're reading the story. And the mention of the cameras makes it potentially clear. And then, is it the heat that makes my skin crawl, or those eyes? The attention, the publicity of this is something that is going to mean something. This one, it goes on to talk about, as a kid, associating the smell with summer holidays, why she associates it with that, and it's just like a lot of telling about it rather than it being like you know, like all of that that's highlighted, plus the bit with the first, like basically the whole paragraph has been summarized much neater in this, right? In a way that isn't as on the nose. And that's the kind of editing that you want to do. You also want to do things like, what isn't familiar to me is the media attention that is said out loud. But then you have this bit where it's like, there's more to it now, cameras follow me into the paddock. That's the media attention. And it's not mentioned out loud that it's media attention, but you know that if the cameras are following her, catching her, the use of the word catching, it kind of implies almost like she's prey to these people, right? Like it's an interesting way of saying the same thing. And again, I feel really weird discussing my own work like this, but I am an English student. I love English literature. I love analysing work. Word choice is important. When you are editing your story, when you have got your, you know, your plot, your characters, you have to start working on the line level. And this editing sort of stage, you go through all of that, right? You start with the developmental, then you go to the sort of like the characters, making sure that they're right, and then you really get to grips with all these different things. So what I've done is I've made the same sort of themes available, but I've done it in a way that isn't me telling you that those themes are there. It is me implying that those themes are there, and it's very overt, but it's not on the nose. And it's like that sort of thing that you want to do, basically. And if we then go down, she's signing things, her hands shake the way through signatures. The violet strokes of my team issue marker. That line also tells you that she is with a team that cares so much about their image that they give her a very specific pen to sign things with, right? Whereas the other one, the only thing that's really mentioned is that she isn't quite sure of her signatures and that the team's hats are a little strange for her to be signing her signature on. There's no mention of like anything that would make you necessarily think that the team has this allure to it. Whereas this one, what kind of team has their own pen that they give to people to sign stuff with? One that has an image that they're trying to take care of, right? Like you get that vibe of prestige. Then you have like the hundreds of different things, trading cards, blah blah blah, and the fact that she keeps signing until she physically is like in pain from doing this, and there's still more people, and she feels bad about that because she's not used to so many people. You see what I mean? Like I hate talking about my own book like this because if other people should be doing this, you know, and getting into it, because it feels really weird for me to like call myself out and the good stuff that I've done or whatever. But that sort of stuff is important, and hopefully it's helpful for you to understand that like in this editing process, you are taking the concept that you have written out in your draft. You are taking all of the research that you have put in and you are making it worth it. Because you're making this story, not just you going, look at what I learned. Look at what I had to learn to write this book. Look at what my sort of character work is like. Look at how good it is. Look how solid these characters are. You're doing it in a way that is much gentler, that kind of eases readers in. And I think that that is the sort of final things that you want to be doing. You then, once you've done all of that, you do the basic edits. Like for spelling, you want to go through with filler words. There are like lists of filler words. I would recommend looking those up, going through them. Words like also, and, but, just check. Also, question marks, exclamation marks. How often are you using those? Not to say that it's a specific number, but you might think like, are there phrases, are there words, are there pieces of punctuation that I'm using so much that readers are going to be like, God, they really liked that one key on the keyboard, huh? I will say that I do sometimes think that when I'm reading. And it can take you out of it. So you want to go through like those editing stages. And again, there are loads of videos on these specific stages of editing, but basically I go through those like editing things in that sort of order. I do the biggest changes and then the bit like less big but still kind of big, and then the smaller, and then the smallest. And you should do that. You should change the things that need to be done on a wide scale that are going to change the whole story before you get onto the edits and make pretty lines, because those pretty lines, they might not make the cut if that storyline isn't going to stay. And I would highly recommend talking to people, as I said, get a beta reader, and then leave it and come back to it with a fresher mind, because you, especially if you keep writing and learning about writing, your brain's going to keep getting better. This is my draft like 4, and I say draft 4, this includes this draft, and you can see again, there's no prologue in this because I cut the prologue because it was unnecessary. Prologues, unless they are absolutely essential, are kind of looked down upon, because a lot of writers like myself in that first draft use them for like a vibe, right? Because it's like it's a prologue. And it's not super useful. And I'm just kind of yapping here. This might not even be the most helpful video, but I do think that it, again, that first line, which I really liked, but we've still got all of this, you know, the exposition that's just very info dumpy. This I like, to be honest. I like the vibe of it, you know, the suggestion that at the time when she was a kid, it was enjoyment, not like this is going to be my career that was making her do this, but that you know, it's suggested to have changed in that time. And I think that it's also really interesting because like you know, like it's I think it's interesting from the perspective of like, this is my character and seeing this part of her is interesting, but from a reader's perspective it's just not as immersive as this, and of then this immediately following it, of immediately being like, this is the world I'm in now, is one with cameras and fans and people who didn't know who I was. You know, I'm new to this and I feel new, but without objectively saying like the stuff that was said in the originals. And if we go to this, again, she starts taking it seriously, and that's interesting, but why do we care? Why is it taking this long for us to get to the story start? And then we go on to the next page. Again, a lot of this has changed. Similar sort of stuff. But again, it's just... Again, I'm sure I'll grow used to it in time, but I'm struggling to remember how it looks. It's still a bit showy. You know, it's like, I am not used to it. Whereas you get the vibe of that from the fact that she feels guilty for not signing everything, even though that is like the norm because it's impossible to sign everything. Like, basically through the drafts, you figure out your writing style, you figure out your characters, you figure out what is important in the plot. You have to be willing to cut stuff out. And that is how you get to the point where you're able to work on a line level and make sentences that are just better at conveying the information without being like, this is the information, by the way. Because that's not good. It's not terrible, you know, it's not the worst thing ever, but a lot of people don't love reading stuff like that. And I think I will read again the first page of like this book, which is just the one that I'm reading right now, is, with the building dark beneath it, the skylight on the roof of the land trust was a pyramid of pure black. And again, I just started reading this. I finished my draft ages ago, so you can see that this wasn't like an intentional thing. But again, you don't know what the land trust is yet. You don't really know what the pyramid skylight, you know, is doing in this scene. The same way that you don't understand what the sun and the heat lines of the car park and like the desert and stuff mean yet. But you get the vibe of like, okay, so we're on a roof with this big skylight. on a building that is significant somehow because it has a name that is capitalized. I'll read another book, okay? We'll read the first page of The Bell Jar, which I know basically anyway. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. That is a really good one also, because again, you're in New York. You know that. It's summer, it's pretty warm, you get that vibe. And it's also mentioning outright the deaths of some like criminals. And especially like when you've read the rest of the book, the third line is the idea of being electrocuted makes me sick. I think that's important. It's an important line. And it, again, you don't necessarily understand why that sort of stuff is being mentioned. But then you get into like the themes of the book as it progresses and it becomes more obvious. To read another one of my favourites, which happen to be the closest books to me because they're on my favourite shelf. There is a prologue in this book. Let me see if I should read the prologue or... Okay, so the prologue begins with, "Listen, 3 miles deep in the forest, just below Arnott's Ridge, and you're in silence so dense it's like you're wading through it." That again has a vibe. I'll let you decide what that vibe is. But then the first chapter begins, "It was, everyone agreed, fanning themselves outside the store or passing in the shade of the eucalyptus trees, unseasonably warm for September." And again, you get the vibe. It's warm, right? You heat the senses, basically. Use the senses. Give your reader a sense of where they are. The book that got criticised a lot for this lately of White Room Syndrome was Age of Scorpius by Audrey Winter. No hate to that author, by the way. But the first chapter of that begins with like something about Conviction Woods, but it doesn't describe what the woods are like. Anyway, it just starts with being like, this place and this place. This place is a place that is a place. And you're just like, okay, but what is the place like? So starting with sensory stuff is pretty good because it gives your reader somewhere to stand while the rest of the details load in, right? I chose to make it very clear, this is a desert. We're in a desert. And then it goes into a building where she's in a kitchen and it is described a little bit. You know, you get a glimpse of like the floors and the fact that she's in a kitchen. It looks like a kitchen. She describes things like what it's like to drive on this track. You get like the idea of where you are as a reader in this story because you are a character in this story. The reader, there are books that actually utilize that by, you know, breaking the fourth wall basically. But it's so important to do that. And I think basically what you should be trying to do is not like do what I do, but in your editing, go for that sort of stuff. The further that you get into your editing, the more drafts that you have, the more solid that your foundations are, the more significant you can make each sentence. And it's not like you have to write sentence upon sentence. I'm not like a particularly like beautiful writer. I like the idea of being a simplistic writer. I like a lot of the classics, specifically the modern classics. You can see on my shelf a bunch of like modern classics, contemporary stories. I like those. This is a contemporary, you know, it's a noir novel and it's set in the 20s, but the language is not all that like complex. And I don't say that as an insult. I just say it because I think that there are some more flowery writers and that's fine. I'm not that kind of writer. I don't like reading that stuff as much. And I think that there is a lot of beauty in the simplicity of some sentences. And I feel like my opening paragraph does a good job of setting the right vibe. It does the right job of making you understand that this book is as much about the cameras and the attention and the sort of pressures that my character faces, especially from her internal stuff, internal and external pressures, the challenges that you face on the inside and the outside. Very important. Look into like interiority and just make sure that your characters have that balance because it is hugely important to the plot and you should be getting that checked. But then you can make it more obvious in subtle ways through your writing and when you polish it up, basically. And so you understand this character a little bit better, but you also understand where you are, and there's that mix, and I think that is what kind of works. So I'm gonna say that that is like the end of my process. I know that this has probably been a whole lot of nothing, but I feel like it's kind of interesting to talk about. That is what you want to do, basically, though. You want to come up with an idea, research, start your plan. That includes things like, you know, where your characters fit into your plan. Then you want to do your first draft, wait a bit, read it, make some notes. Second draft, I personally would do beta readers after the second or third draft, depending on how much work needed to be done, whether or not you think that the draft is close to the way that the story is going to end up at the end, because that's like, you don't want to waste people's beta reading on a book that you know you're going to change a lot of stuff anyway. Because then the feedback is probably going to just be like, oh, I didn't love this bit, and you're going to be like, yeah, I was going to change that anyway, and it's kind of useless, you know, because especially some beta readers, they don't tend to give very detailed feedback, so you need to bear that in mind. You also, I would say, you should be doing like 4 drafts as a sort of minimum, depending on what you count as a draft. Some books need less than that. Some writers need less than that because they write really polished first drafts. If you've never written a book before, don't be afraid to have to do multiple drafts. Don't be afraid to have to wait a while to let your brain forget it a bit before you come back. I rushed into querying, and I wish I hadn't, because the difference is between what I first queried and what I now have, the version that you just saw, huge. Like, I rewrote the whole opening, and I was like, I need to rewrite this whole book, because I was just like, I can do so much better now, because I have better instincts now. And I think part of that is because of reading. You should do your drafts, your editing, different stages. Again, look that up. There's loads of info out there about the different types of editing that you can do on a draft, the different stages that you go through, and like when to do each one. Read a lot, okay? Read stuff that isn't in your usual genre. Read stuff that you're thinking, this isn't the best, and think, why isn't it the best? Think, why am I enjoying this so much? What is it? The characters? Is it the plot? Is it the world building? Is it, you know, the way that the story is like written in a sort of line level? Like, I enjoyed the writing from Babel, which I DNF'd because I wasn't enjoying the story. I felt bored, and it was interesting at times, but at other times it was like, yeah, okay, yeah. And I feel like that is something that, like, obviously that's a majorly successful book, but I do also know that other people have felt that way, and I feel like it is one of those things where it's like, maybe if you were writing your own book and you didn't have the same appeal of that author who is mega, then you might want to think about making your book, you know, I don't know. You might want to edit your book differently based off of the audience that you have. If you have no audience, it can help to play in to the things that are popular. You know, if you have a romance and you've got tropes, use that in your marketing, but also make sure that the trope is written well. You know, use those sorts of things to figure out how to edit. And I'm rambling. There's so much that I could say about like all the different stages, but it's not also that helpful because everyone has different things that they need to edit. And basically, idea, research, plotting, that includes your outline, okay? Do an outline, chapter by chapter, scene by scene, first draft, other drafts, and the final edits. Sort of like 6 things, really. And you want to throw in beta readers, you want to throw in, you know, time away from the manuscript and reading. That's my advice, to summarize. And I don't know how helpful this was, but I hope that maybe, I feel like that editing section was probably the most helpful, showing you the way that I've changed it and how I've incorporated the old stuff into the new. I think my main advice for that would be, don't be afraid to prune away the bad stuff, because it's how you get the new growth that is significantly better. And I cut out, as I said in my final draft that I just did this like 2 months ago, I think. Time is traveling really fast. But the draft that I'm now querying is significantly better. I cut out multiple chapters. I was able to expand certain things and to cut away unnecessary things. And I think you gain that skill through doing it. So don't be afraid to try. Just create new documents. You see, I have my old ones. And start in a new document if you get intimidated. Don't be afraid. I think people see the idea of rewriting as you starting completely from scratch. What you are doing is you are editing, but you are editing into a new document, and it can be so freeing for your mind if you hate like visual clutter. Honestly, fully recommend doing it. And I do think that helps a lot of people actually. So yeah, have fun with that. Let me know what your books are about if you're watching this because you want to start writing, or because you have no idea where to go next, or if you are just curious and you're a writer and you're like, I wonder what that writer's process is. Tell me about your books. I love hearing about people's books. I can't stop talking about mine when I get onto them, which is why this video is so long, even though I was like, this can be quick. Sorry about that. But I hope it was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye. And then the second stage, that scared the life out of me, Pabs. My cat just made a noise and that freaked me right out. I'm sorry. You're gonna read the way that I just typed that. My only defense is that the keyboard is really far away.